For almost 3 months, I thought the man across the street was watching me, and at 61 years old, I was embarrassed enough by that thought to keep it mostly to myself. There is a particular humiliation in suspecting you are the object of something unsettling and not having enough proof to make the suspicion sound adult. If you're 22, people call it instincts. If you're 61 and living in a respectable neighborhood with trimmed hedges, HOA newsletters, and men who still wash their own cars in loafers, people call it nerves. So I told myself it was nerves. I told myself that the older man in the gray windbreaker, who always seemed to be standing at the edge of his driveway when I came home, was simply retired and bored. I told myself that when I looked up from my hydrangeas and found him across the street by the mailbox, facing my house too directly, it meant nothing. I told myself that when I noticed him twice in 1 week slowing his car near our corner at exactly the same time Glenn should have already been at the office, it was coincidence. Then one damp Thursday afternoon, he crossed my lawn without asking, stopped 2 feet from my porch and said, "Mrs. Holloway, I need you to understand something before you get scared of the wrong person. I'm not watching you. I'm watching your husband." That is not the sort of sentence an older woman hears and forgets. My husband, Glenn, and I had lived in Maple Crest for 11 years by then. Long enough for neighbors to know which recycling bin was ours. Long enough for Christmas cards to arrive with no first names. Long enough for our habits to become neighborhood furniture. Glenn was 66, semi-retired from commercial insurance, and exactly the kind of man people trust too easily because he had spent most of his life learning how to sound responsible while revealing almost nothing. He knew the names of everyone's grandchildren, helped carry folding chairs after church fundraisers, fixed sprinklers for widows without making them feel helpless, and had one of those voices that always suggested the room would calm down if people just listened to him for another minute. I had been married to that voice for 32 years, long enough to stop hearing what it omitted. When we moved into the neighborhood, the man across the street introduced himself as Frank Donnelly, widower, Navy veteran, retired building inspector. The kind of man who always looked slightly wind-chapped, as if weather had chosen him for extra practice. He was never warm exactly, but he was civil. He waved. He kept to himself. He mowed in straight, severe lines and put his trash out before anyone else. The first few years, he barely registered to me at all, which is probably why it took me too long to understand that his attention wasn't new. My awareness of it was. The first time I really noticed him was after a Sunday dinner 2 months earlier, when Glenn came home later than expected and claimed he had stopped at the office to print some old policy statements for a former client. It was already dusk when he pulled into the driveway. I was standing at the kitchen sink, and through the front window, I saw Frank sitting in his truck with the engine off, facing our house from across the street. He didn't wave when he noticed me. He just looked once toward Glenn's car, then started the engine and drove off. It was strange enough that I mentioned it. Glenn laughed, not unkindly, and said, "Frank's always looking at something like he's halfway through writing a complaint letter in his head." I laughed too, because that was easier than explaining the small, cold thing I had felt watching the truck lights disappear. A week later, I saw Frank again near the side of our yard while I was watering the roses. He wasn't on our property, but he was close enough to make me uncomfortable, standing by the fence line with his hands in his jacket pockets. I asked if everything was all right. He looked at me, then at the house, and said, "Just making sure." Making sure of what? He didn't answer. He nodded once and walked back across the street. When I told Glenn that night, he rolled his eyes and said Frank had probably become one of those neighborhood men who thinks everyone else's life is his civic project. "Ignore him," he said. "He's from that generation that thinks observing things counts as usefulness." Glenn was from that generation too, which should have made the joke flatter than it did. If you had asked me then whether anything was actually wrong in my marriage, I would have said no with enough conviction to embarrass myself now. Not because Glenn and I were blissful. We weren't. But older marriages are complicated in ways younger people often mistake for emptiness. By your 60s, not every silence is ominous and not every irritability means betrayal. Bodies hurt, careers taper, children live elsewhere, parents die. Old resentments dry into habits and habits get mistaken for peace. Glenn and I had settled into the kind of marriage people compliment when they mean it looks durable from the curb. He handled most of the practical things because he had always liked control disguised as competence. I handled the social things, the remembering, the birthdays, the details that keep a home from feeling like storage. We had one son in Denver, one daughter in Charlotte, and the sort of holiday rotation that makes family feel both precious and heavily scheduled. No shouting, no affairs that I knew of, no dramatic secrets, just a husband who had become slightly harder to read with age and a wife who had learned to call unreadable men steady if enough years had already gone by. The trouble with that kind of marriage is that when something actually begins to rot, you are already too practiced at explaining discomfort away. About 6 months before Frank crossed my lawn, Glenn became suddenly obsessed with our back property line. Not in a loud way, in a practical way. He started asking whether we still had the old survey. He mentioned liability if one of the neighborhood teenagers cut through the yards and hurt themselves. He suggested adding a better lock to the side gate because you never know who wanders where these days. It all sounded responsible. That was Glenn's gift. Every controlling instinct arrived wearing a reflective vest and holding a clipboard. He even hired a tree service to trim the large maple near the corner of our lot, saying the overgrowth made it too easy for people to hide themselves. At the time I assumed he meant prowlers, teenagers, dear, the miscellaneous threats suburban men invent when they don't want to name whatever actually troubles them. Only later did I understand he had become anxious about sight lines, not safety. The next thing that changed was money, though I didn't see it clearly then. Glenn began insisting on using cash more often for small things. Garden center purchases, hardware store runs, gas. He said it helped him feel the spend now that we were both more aware of retirement budgeting. That sounded sensible enough. Sensible enough that I almost missed the fact that while he was suddenly pushing cash for small purchases, he was also becoming strangely vague about several large ones. A roofing deposit. An insurance premium adjustment. A contractor he said needed a check before coming back to finish some work at the garage. If I asked for invoices, he always had an answer. He'd left the folder at the office. The paperwork hadn't been itemized yet. Roger from the bank was cleaning up the statement. It was never enough to justify a fight, just enough to leave me lightly dissatisfied and then faintly ashamed for caring. One Tuesday afternoon, I came home from lunch with a friend and found Glenn and Frank in the middle of our driveway speaking in low voices. That scene alone would have startled anyone who knew them. They weren't friendly men. Civil, yes. Neighborly, maybe, but not conversational, and certainly not close enough to be standing beside Glenn's car with both of them speaking as if something practical and unwelcome needed handling quickly. The second Glenn saw me turn into the drive, he stepped back and called out, too brightly, "Frank was just telling me about the HOA issue with the drainage ditch." Frank didn't smile. He didn't support the explanation. He simply looked at me once in a way I couldn't read and walked back across the street without another word. Later that evening, I asked Glenn what that was really about. He shrugged and said Frank had always exaggerated little neighborhood concerns. "He likes being the first man to know a thing," he said. "It gives him purpose." When I asked why Frank had looked angry, Glenn answered, "You always assign emotion to men who are just standing there." That sentence bothered me more than the explanation itself. Then came the envelope. It was tucked under the rubber tray in Glenn's console, visible only because I was looking for the registration while he was inside the pharmacy. White business envelope, no return address on the front, just our street number and Glenn's first name in blue ink. On the back flap, in blockier writing, 3 words, "This is enough." I should have put it back untouched. Instead, I opened it with the same careful guilt women feel when they have not yet fully admitted they are already being excluded from the truth. Inside were 4 photographs. Each one showed Glenn at the far end of the old rail trail 2 miles from our house, near the abandoned service road that cuts behind the drainage basin and loops back to the main highway. In 2 of the photos, he was alone, standing beside his car with the trunk open. In one, he was handing an envelope to a man in a baseball cap. In the last, blurred but unmistakable, he was with a woman. Not close enough to scream affair, close enough to scream hidden. I slid the photographs back into the envelope just before Glenn returned to the car. My heart was pounding hard enough that I thought surely he would hear it over the engine when he started the ignition. He asked if I found the registration. I said yes. We drove home in silence, and for the first time since our 20s, I had the distinct sensation of sitting beside a man who was already more committed to whatever he was hiding than to the version of peace I was still trying to preserve. The next morning, Frank crossed my lawn. That is when he told me he wasn't watching me. He was watching my husband. Not because he enjoyed it, because he had started seeing patterns he couldn't unsee. Glenn leaving at odd times, meeting the same unfamiliar car near the trail, entering the old service road after dark more than once, pulling into our driveway later with no reason that matched the timing he gave the neighborhood. Frank had not said anything sooner because, as he put it, a man doesn't go to another man's wife with suspicions unless he's willing to be hated if he's wrong. I asked why he believed he was right now. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a folded receipt, and handed it to me. It was from the storage yard, behind the rail trail. Unit 47B. Paid in Glenn's name. The date was 3 weeks earlier. Same day he told me he'd been at the office helping a former client review an annuity schedule. I asked Frank why he had that receipt. He said, "Because your husband dropped it in my driveway, and I recognized your surname before I recognized the danger." That line sat between us like a threat, not from him, from truth. I spent the next 24 hours doing what older women are forced to become excellent at when something in life finally demands action, functioning normally while rearranging everything internally. I made dinner. I called my daughter. I folded laundry. I let Glenn kiss my forehead before bed. And underneath all of it, I kept hearing Frank say before I recognized the danger. Not suspicion, not oddness. Danger. At our age, you do not use that word lightly. The storage yard sat in an industrial strip behind the rail trail and looked exactly like the sort of place secrets choose when they need fluorescent lighting and bad gravel. Chain-link fence, keypad gate, cameras too obvious to be comforting. I went the next afternoon while Glenn was at lunch with 2 former coworkers, something I knew because he had complained twice about one of the men's blood pressure medication, and therefore accidentally made the plan memorable. I rented a small unit in cash under the excuse of temporary home organization, just to get legal access to the property and the manager's casual trust. Then I walked the rows until I found 47B. I did not have a key. I did, however, have 61 years of paying attention to the ways men hide carelessly when they believe women won't escalate. Glenn's key ring always rode in the ceramic bowl by the mudroom door. One small brass key with no label had appeared on it around Easter. I had assumed it belonged to some old office cabinet. That morning, before he came down for coffee, I pressed it into a bar of hand soap, rinsed it, dried it, and tucked the impression into my purse. By 2 o'clock, the locksmith at the hardware store had made me a copy without asking a single interesting question, because old ladies with practical shoes and clipped errands are invisible in the best possible way. The unit smelled like dust, cardboard, an expensive mistake. Inside were not drugs or bodies or piles of cash, nothing young enough for television. There were file boxes, binders, campaign signage, and one locked metal cabinet. The signage was for a city council race in the neighboring district. The binders carried the name of a candidate I vaguely knew from local charity events, Harold Dean, longtime businessman, family man. Conservative enough for older donors, modern enough for younger professionals. Exactly the sort of man who'd give speeches about integrity while asking volunteers to move folding tables after the prayer breakfast. The file boxes contained direct mail drafts, donor rolls, expense reports, and photographs of Harold at events he probably preferred not to have photographed. The locked cabinet I couldn't open there, but the labels on the folders were enough to make me cold. Donor pressure, opposition leverage, quiet disbursements, M. Wolf retainer. And then I saw Glenn's handwriting. Not on one page, on dozens. Schedules, notes, delivery times, drop sites, names, amounts. My husband was not having an affair. He was running blackmail logistics for a city council campaign. I sat on an upturned crate inside that storage unit and laughed once, a horrible small laugh that sounded like a stranger. Because of course that was somehow worse. Not because adultery hurts less, but because adultery would at least have been ordinary. This was something colder. A second life built on leverage, donor intimidation, off-books cash movement, and secrecy so practiced it had turned a suburban husband into an operations man for corruption without ever costing him his place at my table. The ride home felt longer than the drive out because now the problem had shape. My husband wasn't just lying to me. He was entangled in something that made neighbors watch from windows and grown men meet on service roads with envelopes. And if Frank had noticed enough to cross my lawn, others had noticed too. Which meant the clock on whatever Glenn thought he was managing had already started. I called Frank that evening and asked him one question. Did you ever see anyone else with him, besides the man in the baseball cap? He was quiet for a second. Then he said, one woman, once. Sharp coat, dark car, looked like she belonged in city offices, not trails. And one man I know from Harold Dean's fundraiser committee. Why? I said, because I think my husband isn't cheating on me. I think he's helping someone cheat a lot of other people. Frank didn't answer immediately. Then he said, that sounds expensive. It's going to be, I told him. That was when the story changed from discovery to revenge. Not loud revenge, not kitchen screaming, glass-breaking revenge. I was too old to waste good evidence on bad timing. Glenn had spent years believing I preferred peace strongly enough to protect him from consequences. That assumption was the only gift he gave me in the entire mess, because once I knew what he was doing, he still believed I did not know enough to hurt him. The campaign fundraiser that Harold Dean's committee had been promoting for weeks was set for Saturday night at the Lakeside Civic Club. Half the town would be there. Church couples, donors, Rotarians, widows with foundation money, men with red faces and golf voices, women in silk blouses pretending they still enjoyed dry chicken and strategic applause. Glenn was scheduled to assist with logistics, which apparently included moving envelopes, final donor tallies, and one locked dispatch case I had already seen in the storage unit photographs. Harold Dean himself would speak. Respectability would be polished and plated. I told Glenn I was looking forward to it. Then I spent 2 straight days with my daughter, a state investigator she quietly connected me to through a friend's husband, and Frank, who turned out to have exactly the skills that a retired building inspector from the Navy might have if you gave him a quiet war to finish. He had dates. He had times. He had notes. He had more patience than sentiment. Between my documents and his observations, the investigator saw enough to tell us what would matter most: chain of possession, public handling of the envelopes, and proof that Glenn had custody of records he should not legally be moving. He could not promise arrests on the spot. Real life doesn't often give you that kind of theater. But he promised presence, observation, and timing. That was enough for me. Saturday night, Glenn looked almost young in his tuxedo. That bothered me more than it should have. Maybe because men become most handsome when they believe they are still successfully dividing the world into what women know and what women are for. He asked if my necklace clasp was sitting properly, kissed my cheek, and said, "Try not to get trapped with the donor widows too long tonight, or you'll never escape." I smiled and adjusted his cufflink. It still amazes me how well women can perform normal when survival finally requires it. The ballroom was exactly what you imagine. Good linen, too much navy, soft live piano no one was really listening to. Glenn moved through the room not as a husband, but as infrastructure. Quiet, useful, trusted, hand to elbow, folder to handoff, doorway to side hall. No one looked at him too long because men like that are designed not to be looked at too long. That is why Frank mattered. He was the first person in years who had watched Glenn without accepting the default story. The investigator and 2 plainclothes officers were already there, scattered naturally enough that only people who had spent time around procedure would notice. Frank stood near the coat check in his gray jacket, looking exactly like the sort of retired man no one pays attention to after the second handshake. My daughter sat at table 9 with a donor couple and an expression of pleasant civic endurance. Harold Dean was at the podium thanking everyone for believing in transparent local leadership. Transparent. I nearly smiled. The envelope exchange happened between the main course and dessert. Glenn took the locked dispatch case through the side corridor behind the ballroom, exactly as the storage documents suggested he would. I followed 10 seconds later, not running, not hiding, just moving with the calm purpose of a wife who knows where the bathrooms are. The corridor ended in a service alcove outside the administrative office. Glenn had already handed a thick packet to Harold's campaign treasurer and was pulling a second bundle from the case when the investigator stepped in from the opposite side and said, "Gentlemen, let's keep those exactly where they are." No one yelled. That's what made it glorious. Because men who are always operating one layer beneath public scandal never expect the correction to arrive in a normal tone. They expect drama from women and deference from rooms. Instead, what Glenn got was procedure. One officer at the door, one by the case, one request for identification, one question about the source of the materials. Harold Dean appeared from the ballroom entrance, smiling at first, then not. I stepped forward just far enough that Glenn had to see me before he could invent a version of events built on my absence. The look on his face was worth more than any speech I could have given. Not panic, recognition. He knew, instantly, that the neighbor he thought was a nuisance, and the wife he thought was preserving peace had already done more work than he imagined possible. I said only one thing. "You should have worried more about who was paying attention." Then I stepped aside and let the professionals do what professionals do. The payoff did not come in a single explosion that night. It came in layers, which is better when you've waited long enough. Glenn was not marched through the ballroom in handcuffs, though I admit a smaller woman might have wanted that. The case was taken. Statements were taken. Harold's speech ended early and people left under the sort of confusion that spreads gossip better than scandal ever could. The real damage came in the weeks after. Financial reviews, quiet subpoenas, donor panic, committee fractures. Newspaper wording careful enough to avoid libel and sharp enough to destroy a campaign. Glenn's name appearing in the wrong places. Harold Dean withdrawing for family reasons. The treasurer resigning. The party distancing itself. Our church suddenly discovering it had always found certain arrangements around Glenn a little unclear. And Glenn. He tried every version of himself. The misunderstood helper. The low-level errand man. The husband who got pulled too far into something bigger than he realized. The protector who kept me out of it because he was trying to shield me. That one almost made me admire the cruelty of his consistency. Even then, even after years of secret envelopes and storage units and neighbors keeping notes like wartime civilians, he still reached for the old marriage script. "I did this for you by not telling you." The divorce was quick because guilt accelerates paperwork when exposure has already started eating the furniture. I got the house. I got the accounts he had not yet touched. I got, through Frank's testimony and the investigator's files, The unarguable public truth that my husband had not been the trustworthy older man everyone thought he was. And that mattered more than people realize. Older women are too often told that dignity means leaving quietly, especially when what a husband has done is complicated enough to sound exhausting in summary. No. Dignity, in my experience, is sometimes letting the right people see the whole shape of a man before he gets the chance to round his edges again. Frank and I never became romantic. People always want that ending. They want the quiet neighbor to turn into the late-life surprise. Life did not give me that, and I didn't need it. What he gave me was rarer and, at that age, more useful. Corroboration without appetite. He saw what he saw, kept seeing it when it became inconvenient, and crossed my lawn only when he believed the danger of staying silent had grown larger than the danger of being hated. I trusted him for exactly that reason. Desire complicates too much. Attention, correctly used, saves lives. The greatest satisfaction came 6 months later, when I was replanting the front bed and noticed the street had gone back to being ordinary. Glenn gone. Harold Dean gone from signs and newsletters and people's mouths. No trucks idling where they shouldn't. No one slowing at our corner unless they actually lived there. Frank across the street changing the oil on his mower. The neighborhood had not become better, exactly. Neighborhoods never do. They just resume pretending that scandal was a weather event instead of a system of choices. But for the first time in a long while, the pretense no longer depended on me swallowing what I knew. That was the real reward. Not revenge in the dramatic sense, revelation with consequences. Because what Glenn stole first was not money or fidelity or trust. It was my right to understand the life I was standing inside while it was still happening. Getting that back was worth every document, every lie through clenched teeth, every ordinary dinner I had to cook while building the end of his secret life in silence. If you liked this one, I've left another story for you on screen about a woman whose husband let his mother humiliate her for years, until one financial betrayal finally showed her exactly who he had chosen all along. Click that one next.